Good morning, dear friends. My name is George Whitmore, but most folks in the village of Farnley Edge, Yorkshire, just call me Old George by the Hill. I'm 84 now, and every crease on my weathered face has a story, some filled with laughter, others soaked in pain. Today, if you'll allow me, I'd like to tell you the one story that shaped everything, my journey from a shattered boy to the man who built a $1 million empire. This tale, it isn't glamorous. It's not about wealth. It's about survival. Before I begin, if you're someone who believes that no child should ever have to endure fear in their own home, would you let me know in the comments? Just a simple amen or I'm with you, George. You don't know how much strength it gives a tired soul like mine. I was born in 1941 in a small, damp cottage on the outskirts of a village few had heard of then. My mother, Margaret, was a quiet seamstress. Gentle, almost too gentle for this harsh world. My father, Harold, worked at the sawmill down by the canal, tall, strong, well respected by the townsfolk, feared, deeply feared at home. He had what the older folks used to call a temper, but now I know better. He was cruel, a man who knew how to wear a smile for the church pew but kept fists for the walls of his home. But then there was Granddad James. He lived with us. After Grandma passed, tucked away in the little back room that smelled of tobacco and liniment. He was my light in that house of shadows. An old carpenter, long retired, but he never stopped working with his hands. He built me little wooden horses, carved from firewood scraps. He told stories, made up poems, and always believed I was destined for something more. When I'd come home from school, bruised not by bullies but by my own father's scorn, Granddad was there. He'd place his gnarled hand on my shoulder and say, "Lad, some men are born with sunshine in their chest and others, well, storms. Your father's thunder isn't your fault, but you don't let his storm drown your light." I was never praised, not once. My father thought kindness bred weakness. If I dropped a cup, I was useless. If I got a C in spelling, I was a disgrace. A child could never win. And punishment? It came swiftly and without mercy. He'd make me kneel on gravel outside the shed until my legs bled, or shut me in the root cellar with the rats for speaking out of turn. My mother never intervened, not with words. But late at night, when he snored in drunken oblivion, she'd come silently to my bed with a bit of ointment and whisper lullabies that her voice barely remembered. But Granddad, he was different. He stood up to my father, even frail, even old. He'd raise his voice and say, "Harold, lay a hand on that boy again and you'll answer to me." Somehow my father would pause, maybe out of fear, maybe out of financial dependence. Granddad's pension kept that house afloat when the ale drained all else. On nights when my father worked the graveyard shift, our house came alive. Granddad would strum his battered banjo, sing me old tunes, and my mother would for once smile. She'd bake apple tarts, and we'd all pretend we were a family. It was Granddad who taught me how to read. He'd sit with me at the porch with an old newspaper from the butcher's shop and say, "Read slow, lad. A misread word is like bad timber in a house. It'll crack under pressure." He was also the first person to believe in my dream of building things, not toys, but real buildings. When I was 8, he gave me a sketch pad and said, "Draw your dreams, George, because if you can draw them, you might just build them." I filled that pad with homes that had round windows, gardens with apple trees, and warm, safe fireplaces. When my father found the drawings, he tore them up, said boys like me were made to work the fields, not live in fantasies. But Granddad, he snuck me a new pad the next day. Keep drawing, lad. A dream drawn is a dream halfway built. It's funny, isn't it? How a man with rough hands and a tired back could speak such truths, but I carried his words with me, tucked in a pocket of my heart where my father's fists couldn't reach them. Life in that house was like walking a tightrope over fire. But we had each other, me, Mum, and Granddad. Until the day came when he didn't wake up. It was a Sunday, cold, still. He passed in his sleep, a gentle smile still curled on his lips. The doctor said it was his heart. I think maybe it just gave up after years of bearing the weight of others' cruelty. And that, dear friends, is when the storm truly began. After Granddad passed, the house changed. It wasn't just quieter. It was colder, emptier. His old banjo sat in the corner unplayed. His tobacco tin was still on the shelf. But without him, the very air inside those walls turned heavy like breathing smoke. My father, Harold, didn't cry at the funeral, didn't flinch when they lowered the coffin. But I noticed something different in his eyes afterward, a glint I had never seen before. Not grief, not even guilt. No, it was hunger, the kind of hunger a predator feels when the only thing standing between it and its prey is finally gone. The very night we returned from the burial, my mother disappeared into her room early, said she had a headache. I stayed behind, washing the tea mugs from the neighbors who came by after the service. The house was silent. I heard the front door creak. Then, as the slow, unsteady footsteps of my father. He had, of course, been drinking. The smell of whiskey and smoke clung to him like a curse. He staggered into the kitchen. "Where's your mother?" he slurred. "In bed," I replied quietly, hoping he'd follow suit. But he didn't. He moved closer, too close. "You think you're the man now, don't you, Huey?" he said, "now that the old bastard's gone?" I said nothing, just stood there, frozen, holding a wet dish in my hand like a shield. His hand landed hard on my shoulder. I flinched. "From now on, it's my rules. No more protecting, no more hiding. You'll learn your place, George." And then something happened, something I've never shared in full, and I won't now either. Some pains, as any of you watching will know, are too deep for words. But I will say this. That night, my father didn't just beat me. He broke something. Not a bone, but something invisible, something sacred. I remember lying on the floor afterward, unable to cry, staring at the old ceiling beams Granddad once fixed. I whispered into the silence, "Please, someone, anyone, help me." But the silence answered back. That was the first time, not the last. My mother knew. I could see it in her eyes the next morning when she found me curled up on the hallway floor. She didn't ask questions, didn't speak. She simply helped me up, pressed a cold cloth to my cheek, and hummed a lullaby she hadn't sung in years. We didn't speak of it, because some truths, when spoken aloud, destroy what little strength you have left. From that day on, the house became a battlefield, and I learned how to survive like a soldier. I studied my father's moods like weather reports. The way his boots landed on the steps told me what kind of night it would be. The number of empty bottles in the bin told me how tightly I'd need to lock my door. But I also learned something else. That survival is not the same as living, and that hope, though battered, still flickers in the corners of even the darkest rooms. It flickered in my sketchbook, which I kept hidden under a loose floorboard every night. When the house slept, or when I pretended it did, I'd draw. Not houses anymore, no. I began sketching escape routes, cities, trains, skylines. I wasn't just drawing buildings, I was building a way out. And then, one day, something shifted. It was a Tuesday afternoon, cold, wet. I came home from school and found my mother with a bruised cheek and eyes red from crying. She sat at the kitchen table, hands shaking, and said one sentence I never thought I'd hear from her lips. "We need to go." I blinked. She looked up, firmer this time. "We need to leave, George, before he takes everything from us." It was like hearing a ghost speak. "Mom, where would we go?" "I don't know, but anywhere is better than here." But plans are dangerous in houses built on fear. Because my father found out. And what followed was a punishment I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. He locked me in Granddad's old room for 3 days. No light, no food, just a bucket and a Bible. But something else happened during those days of darkness. I changed. I was no longer the boy who waited to be rescued. I became someone who would find his own way out, even if it took years. When my father finally opened that door, I looked up at him and said the only thing he wanted to hear, "Yes, sir, I've learned my lesson." But oh, I had learned far more than he realized. After the 3 days locked in Granddad's room, I emerged with a body weakened, but a mind sharper than ever. My father looked me over with his usual contempt, muttered something about breaking the softness out of me, and walked away, satisfied. But something inside me had shifted. He thought he'd crushed me. What he didn't know is that he'd awakened the architect. From that point on, I stopped trying to fight back in obvious ways. I played the part, I did my chores, I nodded when he barked orders. I even said thank you when he tossed me bread like I was a stray dog. But at night, under that same roof, I planned. I drew, I saved. I'd hidden a tin behind the old coal chute. Coins I'd found, odd jobs I'd done in secret. Even money Mum had slipped me when she could. A few shillings here, a few pence there, worthless in his eyes, precious in mine. One evening, while drying dishes with my mother, after another dinner filled with silence and tension, I whispered, "We won't be here forever, Mum." She looked at me, tired, aged well beyond her years, and gave a faint smile. "No," she whispered back, "we won't." But the road to escape wasn't straight. It never is. A few months later, Mum tried to stash some of her earnings from sewing work. Father found the tin under the floorboard. He beat her so badly that day, I thought she wouldn't get up. I remember kneeling beside her afterward, wiping the blood from her lip with a towel, tears running down both our faces, and her saying something through broken breath, "George, if you ever get out, promise me you won't just survive. You'll thrive. You'll build. You'll make something he could never destroy." I held her hand and swore it. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, whispering that promise over and over like a prayer. I will build. I will become. The following week, I began going to the local library every chance I had. Old Mrs. Pennington, the librarian, noticed how often I came, and after a while, she stopped treating me like a poor boy and started treating me like a student. She gave me books on architecture, on engineering, on mathematics, and for the first time in my life, someone outside of Granddad and Mum said something I'll never forget. "You have a mind for shapes, George. You see space in a way most adults never do." I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I couldn't. Tears weren't safe at home. At school, I kept my head down. Teachers ignored me, classmates mocked my worn-out shoes and my quiet nature, but none of it mattered. I had a plan, and the weight of that promise to my mother drove me forward like a hammer striking steel. And then came the fire. But this isn't the fire of ambition I speak of. No, this was the fire that would change everything. It was a Thursday night. Father had gone to the pub, as he always did after payday. But this time, something in my mother was different. She cooked his favorite roast, laid out his best shirt, and told me softly to go spend the night at my teacher's house. "Why?" I asked. She kissed my forehead, her lips trembling. "Because tonight, son, things will change. Just trust me." I didn't understand, but I obeyed. I spent the night at Miss Elmsworth's, the school teacher who always brought sandwiches for those of us too poor to afford lunch. I lay on her guest cot, staring at the ceiling, feeling a weight I couldn't name pressing on my chest. And then, just before dawn, the knock came. The local constable, pale-faced, hat in hand. "There's been an accident," he said. Our cottage had burned to the ground. Father hadn't made it out. My mother, they said, had tried to wake him, but the room was full of smoke. The roof collapsed. The flames took over too fast. She survived. Minor injuries. Shaken, but alive. And just like that, the tyrant was gone. The morning after the fire, I stood beside my mother outside what used to be our home. The roof had collapsed into itself. Blackened beams jutted like broken bones from the foundation. The smell of smoke clung to everything. And there, among the ruins, sat my grandfather's old banjo, charred, melted, but somehow still recognizable. My mother held my hand tighter than she ever had before. Her eyes, red and swollen, stared straight ahead. She didn't speak. Not until the coroner's van drove away with my father's body. Only then did she turn to me and whisper, "We're free, George. We're finally free." But freedom doesn't come with instructions. We had no home, no clothes beyond what we wore, no savings. Everything had gone up in smoke, and yet something had shifted, not in the world around us, but within us. The villagers murmured many things that week. Terrible accident. He was drunk again, wasn't he? Poor Margaret. Poor George. But others, the ones who knew, those who had seen bruises, heard shouts through the thin cottage walls, they said less. Just nodded. Some even offered help, not out of pity, out of silent, reverent respect. And then came the surprise. It turned out that my father had somehow maintained his job's insurance policy. Despite everything, the mill had kept him as a registered employee. When the paperwork settled, the payout from his accidental death came through. Not much by some standards, but for us, it was the equivalent of a king's ransom. Between that and the widow's pension Mum now received, we had something we'd never had before. Options. We didn't buy anything grand. No, we bought a small stone cottage on the edge of town. 2 rooms, 1 bathroom, a leaky roof. But the locks worked, the windows closed, and there was a fireplace that didn't burn in rage, but in warmth. We planted roses in the front yard. We painted the shutters blue. We smiled without fear, and for the first time, I had a desk, a real desk, a place to draw. And oh, did I draw. Houses, bridges, entire cities. I borrowed books from the library, devoured every page on architecture and design. I began staying after school to work on geometry with a teacher who saw something in me no one else had bothered to look for. "You have vision, George," he said once, reviewing my sketch of a town square. "You don't just draw buildings. You draw lives being lived." Those words stuck with me, and so I kept going, studying late into the night while my mother sat at her sewing machine, her own dream now alive. With some of the insurance money, she'd opened a small tailoring shop, nothing fancy, but it paid the bills and, more importantly, gave her back dignity. Sometimes I'd glance over and see her humming softly, guiding fabric under her needle. Her face peaceful, and I'd think to myself, this is what healing looks like. But as I grew older, my dreams grew bolder. By 16, I knew I wanted to be more than just a boy with a pencil and ambition. I wanted to be a real architect, the kind whose buildings gave people what we never had: safety, light, and soul. I applied to architecture school in London. It was a long shot. The acceptance letter arrived in spring. I opened it with shaking hands. My mother stood beside me holding her breath, and there it was. "Congratulations, Mr. Whitmore." We both burst into tears, and that night we celebrated with a shepherd's pie, 2 small glasses of sherry, and a playlist of Granddad's favorite old banjo tunes. We lit a candle in his memory, and I whispered, "We made it, old man, you and me." I arrived in London on a rainy morning in September 1959. The train pulled into King's Cross with a screech, as if the very tracks were warning me, "You don't belong here." I stepped onto the platform with 1 suitcase, a rolled-up sketchbook, and a worn coat that smelled faintly of my mother's lavender soap. She had kissed me goodbye that morning, back in Farnley Edge, her hands trembling, but her voice firm. "Build, George. Not just buildings. Build a life." And now, here I was. London was nothing like our village. It was fast, loud. Everyone looked like they were in a hurry to be somewhere more important than wherever they were. No one smiled. No one looked up. I remember standing outside the station with the address of my student housing written on a scrap of paper, rain slowly soaking through my fur, and thinking, this city will chew me up and spit me out. And it almost did. The college was grand. Tall columns, clean glass, the smell of polished wood, and ambition. The students, well-dressed, confident. Their fathers were lawyers, engineers, architects. Mine had been a ghost who haunted my childhood. I was different, and I knew it. During the first lecture, the professor spoke of symmetry and Renaissance facades. I was still trying to figure out how to afford dinner. When we introduced ourselves in class, the others spoke of summers in Rome, visits to Gaudi's masterpieces in Barcelona, tours of the Bauhaus in Germany. When it was my turn, I cleared my throat and said simply, "I'm George Whitmore. I want to build homes for people who've never had one." There was silence, then a few snickers. One boy even muttered, "Charming." That night, I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, stared at my calloused hands, and nearly packed my bags. But I didn't, because I remembered him, Granddad James. He hadn't needed Rome or Barcelona. He'd needed a workbench, a knife, and a bit of wood, and with those, he carved magic. So I stayed, and I worked harder than anyone else. When the others slept, I sketched. When they partied, I read. When they boasted about connections, I reminded myself of every night I'd spent hiding from fists, not failure. But still, the city pushed back. There were days I couldn't afford both heating and food, so I chose soup and wore an extra pair of socks to bed. My student flat had a draft that whistled through the bricks like an old ghost. Yet, through all of that, something beautiful happened. One cold evening during a design critique, I presented a model I had built from scrap wood and leftover cardboard. A home designed for single mothers with shared gardens, natural light, safe corners for children. When I finished explaining, there was a pause. Then the professor, a tall man with tweed jackets and a reputation for cruelty, looked at me and said, "This is real architecture. Who taught you to think like this?" I smiled. "Just a little. My grandfather," I said, "and pain." From that day on, the tone shifted. I wasn't invited to the clubs or parties, but they began to take notice. Because while the others designed towers for bankers, I designed hope. I graduated in the top 5 of my class. No one had expected it, except me and Mum. She came to London for my graduation wearing a blue dress she had sewn herself, with shoes polished to a shine so bright you could see your future in them. After the ceremony, I took her to the Thames. We sat on a bench overlooking the river, and I handed her a copy of my diploma. She looked at it, then at me, and whispered, "You did it." I shook my head. We did. That evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, I knew that I had won the first battle. But the war, the real war, was just beginning. Because now I had to start building not only a career, but a name. And in a world ruled by money, prestige, and privilege, a boy from nowhere trying to make homes for the forgotten was an outsider. But I had survived worse. Would you like to continue to part 6? In the next part, George takes his first steps into the professional world, an office of cutthroat developers, deals made over cigars and whiskey, and a system rigged against those who dared to care. This is where idealism meets capitalism. And not everyone makes it out whole. Landing a job in architecture fresh out of university in 1960s London was a miracle in itself. Landing one without connections, that was divine intervention or stubbornness. I applied to 12 firms, got rejected by the 27th. Barclay and Trent called me in for an interview only because the secretary had mistaken me for the son of a Lord Whitmore, some aristocrat whose name occasionally popped up in society pages. When I showed up in my borrowed blazer and thick Yorkshire accent, the senior partner, Mr. Trent, stared at me like I'd just walked in off a farm, which, in some sense, I had. He read my file in silence, then said, "Well, you're not what I expected, George." I smiled politely. "Neither was London, sir." He raised an eyebrow. Then, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of pity, he hired me. 6 cents a week, no benefits, a desk wedged between a filing cabinet and the staff kettle. But I didn't care, because I was in, and once I was in, I didn't waste time. I showed up early, stayed late, took notes during meetings where no one asked me to, studied blueprints after hours. I even redrew some layouts, just to see if I could improve the flow of natural light, and quietly slipped them back into the folders. One day, one of the senior designers, a Mr. Halbridge, stormed into my corner holding a blueprint. "Who touched this?" I thought I was about to be fired. I stood. "I did, sir. Just testing some ideas." He stared at me, then down at the drawing, then back at me. "It's better. Keep doing it quietly." And so I did. I climbed slowly from junior assistant to associate. Within 3 years, I had my name listed as contributor on 3 major residential projects. But something began to gnaw at me. The firm didn't build homes, it built assets. Glass boxes stacked sky high, sold to investors, priced so far above affordability that the only people living in them were ghosts of finance. One day, I found myself staring at a luxury apartment plan. The firm was planning to knock down a row of 19th century tenement houses to make room for it. "They're slums, George," the lead partner said when I raised concern. "We're improving the neighborhood." But I had been that neighborhood. I had grown up in the cracks of society, and now I was helping to fill those cracks with marble and gold while families got pushed out. One evening, while reviewing the project, I found the name of the street, Cavendish Row. I froze. That was where one of my classmates had lived, a boy named Yusuf. His father was a baker. They had 6 kids in 2 rooms and still managed to share bread with the neighbors. Now their home would be dust, and I was part of the machine making it happen. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked the streets instead, past the glittering new towers of Canary Wharf, past neon signs that read, "Coming soon, executive flats, starting at $250,000. And I realized something. I was becoming the man my grandfather warned me about. I was drawing beautiful prisons for people who would never live in them. And so the next morning, I handed in my resignation. Mr. Trent was baffled. "You're on the track to become partner in a few years, George." "Then I'd rather walk another road," I said. He blinked. "To what? Some charity housing project?" I nodded. "Exactly that." And I left. No job lined up, no savings to fall back on, just a calling, a fire, the same fire that had burned down the old cottage. But this time, I was the one holding the match. Would you like to continue to part 7? Because this is where George goes all in. No more backing down. No more polite pencil sketches. In the next part, he fights for forgotten communities, designs affordable housing, and builds something not even his enemies could ignore, a legacy. After I left Barclay and Trent, I spent 2 weeks floating. I slept less, walked more, stared at half-finished buildings, and imagined what they could have been if someone had designed them with a beating heart, not a balance sheet. Then, one evening, I sat down in Mum's tiny flat. She had moved to London a year after my graduation, and told her everything. She didn't scold me. She didn't ask how I'd pay rent. She just poured me a cup of tea, set a plate of digestives in front of me, and said, "Then go build what you believe in." So I did. I began volunteering with a local housing co-op in Hackney. Mostly elderly, mostly immigrants, mostly ignored. They lived in crumbling Victorian terraces with leaky roofs and gas meters that ticked like bombs. Landlords charged them triple what the places were worth, and the council turned a blind eye. But the co-op had a dream. Buy the buildings, fix them up, and let people live with dignity. They just didn't have an architect. Until I showed up. My first job was to fix a staircase that had partially collapsed in one of the shared buildings. No funding, no fancy equipment, just borrowed timber, a few volunteers, and a determination so strong it could have held the thing up by itself. And when we finished, when that first resident, a Jamaican war widow named Eileen, was able to walk up to her room without fearing for her life, she held my hand and said, "You're not like the others." I smiled. Neither was my grandfather. News spread. Soon, I was drawing up plans for low-income housing that didn't feel like low-income housing. My buildings had sunlight, ventilation, gardens with flowers instead of just fences. People called me idealistic. Unrealistic, some said. You'll never make money doing this. And maybe they were right. But the day we opened our first completed block, 12 affordable flats named Whitmore Square, an old man walked up to me, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "This is the first time in 60 years I've lived in a place that didn't smell of damp or fear." I earned nothing from that project except a handshake, a thank you, and a bench they named after me. And yet, I'd never felt richer. But not everyone saw it that way. Developers began to notice, not kindly. They saw me as a threat. I was proving that housing could be beautiful, ethical, and not cost millions. "You're undercutting us," one man said at a council meeting. "No, I'm correcting you," I replied. By 1972, I was speaking at town halls, challenging politicians, meeting with mayors, not because I wanted power, but because I'd lived without it. And the people I built for, they had no voice, so I used mine. One particularly heated night at a council debate over a luxury tower plan that would evict 87 families, I stood up and said, "You can build towers so tall they touch the clouds. But if the people who clean the streets can't afford to live beneath them, you've built nothing but monuments to your own greed." The room went silent. Then applause. A week later, the project was halted. I didn't win every battle, but I fought them all. By the late 70s, I had my own firm, 3 employees, a coffee pot that never worked, a leaky roof. Ironically, we called it Anchor Design, because I wanted it to ground people, not price them out. We built community centers in Brixton, redesigned public libraries in Lewisham, renovated elderly care homes in Barnet, and always with the same mantra, dignity is not a luxury, it's a right. Then, in 1980, something happened that I never expected. The Royal Institute of British Architects sent me a letter. They were awarding me the Civic Impact Medal. I stared at it for a full minute, then laughed. Laughed because the boy who once had to draw on newspaper scraps was now being recognized by the very world that had once looked down on him. At the award dinner, surrounded by men in tuxedos and champagne flutes, I stood up to speak. My voice was calm, clear. "You honor me tonight with this medal, But the real honor has always been building homes for people who didn't believe they deserved one. I didn't just give them shelter, they gave me purpose. And for that, I thank you. Would you like to continue to Part 8? In the next chapter, George faces loss, reflection, and the moment that truly tests whether his legacy was built on stone or sand. Because no life, no matter how noble, is without the heartbreak that humbles even the strongest. I was 44 when I met her. Her name was Anna Layton, a journalist who had come to interview me about the community housing project we were building in Holloway. I expected a routine, polite exchange. But the moment she sat down across from me, notebook in hand and that sharp, knowing glint in her eye, I knew this would not be another headline. She asked questions no one else did. Why did you leave Barclay and Trent at the peak of your career? Was it about guilt or justice? Do you ever feel like you're building for others because no one ever built for you? By the end of the interview, I felt like she'd drawn a blueprint of my soul. We didn't fall in love like in films. No candlelit seduction, no sudden kiss in the rain. It was slower. Two people with bruised pasts, orbiting each other, cautious, careful. And then suddenly, one day, not cautious at all, we married 2 years later, a small wedding, in the garden of one of the very housing projects I had designed, surrounded not by architects or donors, but by the very people we built for. A Somali grandmother brought flowers, a boy from the estate played violin. An old man handed me a homemade card that read, "To the builder who finally stayed." And for a while, life felt whole. Anna was my mirror. Where I saw concrete, she saw color. Where I obsessed over structure, she reminded me to pause, to feel, to be. She also reminded me that I was still carrying grief for Granddad, for Mom, who passed in her sleep in '83, and, in ways I hadn't admitted, even for my father. "You don't have to forgive him, George," she said once, "but you do have to stop letting him live in your blueprint." I never forgot that. We had a son in 1987, named him James after Granddad, and for the first time in my life, I watched a child grow up without fear. We read bedtime stories, built cardboard cities, went camping in Yorkshire, where I showed him the old field where my first sketchbook had been buried under a tree during a storm. I told him, "This is where the dream began," and he said, "Then one day I'll build on it too." I cried silently under the wind. But life, like a poorly maintained roof, always leaks eventually. It started with Anna's headaches. She said it was stress, deadlines, long nights editing. We laughed it off at first, but the scans said otherwise. Glioblastoma, stage 4. 6 months, maybe less. I remember sitting in that white hospital room, the sterile smell stinging my throat, as the doctor explained the options, the chemo, the odds. And Anna just nodded. Calm, almost amused. "Tell me, doctor," she said, "will it be worse than trying to convince a council to fund a housing block with sunlight?" We all laughed. None of us were laughing 6 months later. She passed away in spring, holding my hand. At the funeral, I stood in front of the mourners, residents, builders, journalists, children from our projects. And I didn't give a speech. I pulled out one of her old notebooks, and I read her last entry. "George builds homes with bricks. I build stories with ink. But in the end, we're both trying to give people a place to belong." I closed the book, looked at our son, and whispered, "Now it's your turn, James." Grief doesn't come all at once. It drips. You find her jumper in a drawer, her cup still on the shelf, the sound of her voice echoing in your sleep, and yet, somehow, the work continued. Because that's what Anna would have wanted. Not silence, but structure. Not mourning, but motion. So I designed one last project in her honor. A public library in Southwark, built entirely from reclaimed materials, with a children's wing named after her. No plaque, no vanity. Just a simple inscription, carved above the entrance, where stories live. By the time I turned 70, the world had changed. Cranes no longer fascinated me. Contracts no longer excited me. My name was known in planning departments and housing associations. They called me a pioneer of ethical architecture. I used to laugh when I heard that. A pioneer! I was just a boy who once drew houses to escape a nightmare. But now the work was quieter. I no longer chased city approvals or council budgets. I spent more time in community colleges teaching young designers who wore headphones and hoodies, whose laptops held software I couldn't pronounce. And yet, they listened, not because I was famous, but because I spoke the one thing no algorithm could teach: compassion. I told them stories of rooms without windows, of mothers who whispered lullabies in bruised shirt, of homes that healed, of walls that listened, of doors that opened to hope, not just to hallways. One student, a brilliant young woman named Amara, stayed behind after class one day. She asked, "Mr. Whitmore, how did you keep going, even when no one listened?" I looked at her the way my grandfather once looked at me and said, "Because when you grow up in silence, you either learn to whisper or you learn to build a voice." She went on to win a National Design Award the next year for a housing complex built for refugee families in East London. She called it Sanctuary. She mailed me the ribbon. I keep it in a box with my grandfather's compass and Mum's sewing thimble. My son, James, didn't become an architect. He became a social worker. At first, I'll admit, it stung. But one day, I watched him crouch beside a frightened boy whose family had lost their flat. And I saw the exact same fire in his eyes I once saw in mine. He wasn't building walls. He was building people. And I couldn't have been prouder. We still meet every Sunday. He brings his own son, my grandson Theo. And sometimes, while Theo plays in the back garden, James and I talk about life, about legacy. "Do you regret anything, Dad?" he asked once. I thought for a long time. I regret I couldn't save Mum sooner. That Granddad never got to see what I became, that I didn't hold Anna tighter the night before the scan. Then I paused. But I don't regret a single brick I ever laid, because those bricks, they weren't just stone. They were apologies I could never say, dreams I could never afford, songs I could never sing. They were me learning how to rebuild what my father tried to destroy. Now, I spend most of my days in a small cottage just outside Whitby. Not far from where I was born, I sit by the window with a cup of tea, sketch pad in hand, though my hands shake more now. Sometimes I draw buildings, but mostly I draw memories. Mum in her floral apron, Granddad with his banjo, Anna reading in bed, Theo laughing in the garden, me at 10 sitting in the corner of a cold room with the pencil, dreaming of sky. Sometimes I wonder what that boy would think if he saw me now. He wouldn't believe the money, the medals, the buildings. But maybe, just maybe, he'd believe the peace, because I built it, brick by broken brick. I've always believed that buildings can speak, not with words, of course, but with warmth, with quiet, with dignity, the same way people should. Now, at 84, I find myself no longer drafting blueprints, but memories, each one its own foundation. And as I sit here, in this chair by the window, I realize I may not have time to tell them all. The body slows, the breath shortens. The doctor uses words like comfortable and stage. So I've decided to write one last thing, not a design, not a memoir, just a letter to you, whoever you are. Maybe you're watching this in your kitchen alone. Maybe you're young and lost. Maybe you're old and tired. Maybe you're just trying to make sense of a life that hasn't made much sense lately. I want you to know something. You are allowed to rebuild. No matter where you came from, no matter who tried to break you, no matter how crooked the road behind you looks, you can still lay a brick. You can still draw a dream. You can still build something new. I've spent a lifetime designing homes, but the most important one I ever built was inside myself. A home for peace, a shelter from shame, a room for forgiveness, and a window open to hope. If I've left anything behind, let it be this. Don't let the darkness that shaped you define you. Let it refine you. Let it teach you how to build stronger, wider, kinder. And if one day you find a child like I once was, a child hiding drawings under the floorboards, afraid of their own voice, kneel down, hand them a pencil, and say, "You can build too." Because that's all it takes, really. Not money, not medals, just one person who believes. One person who stays. One person who whispers, "It's not too late." I was lucky enough to have a few of those, and now maybe I've become one of them for someone else. Outside my window, the sun is setting over the moors. I can hear Theo laughing with James in the garden. The kettle whistles in the kitchen. And I think to myself, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever built. So if you're still here, still listening, still watching, thank you. Not for the applause, but for letting me finish the story. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's time to lay down the pencil and trust that the rest of the blueprint, whoever picks it up, will carry it forward, brick by brick, story by story, light after light. Goodbye, my friend, and welcome home.